When you buy Kroger brand products, you feel like you're winning. That's because they offer proven quality at lower than low prices. In fact, we guarantee that you and your family will love how Kroger brand products taste, or you get your money back. So next time you're shopping for the family, look for delicious Kroger brand products, because they'll make you all feel like you're winning. Shop now, in-store, or online. Bakers, fresh for everyone.
You're listening to The Drag.
This podcast contains strong language, references, and descriptions of domestic abuse, violence, and suicide. It also has graphic descriptions of gun violence in schools. This episode additionally contains discussion of rape. Mental health is an important part of this story, so please take care while listening. Previously on this season of Darkness.
I attended the funeral for Billy, and he was buried at Fort Sam Houston.
See, I didn't know there was going to be a grand jury. And Chief Miles later years said that I was so distraught that he wanted me to take time off. Bull crap.
Now, Wednesday, we're supposed to be back in class ready to rock. I mean, they weren't cutting us any slack at all.
And they were just, getting all the shrapnel out of my intestines and delivering the baby, who of course was not alive.
So I just had one lung for a while, and then they inflated it or something, and they couldn't get all the little bullet pieces that shattered.
This morning we had a report of a person with a weapon and shots fired by a very customary library.
It happened again.
Officers responded very quickly in a joint response back to the University of Texas police officers and Austin police officers.
A student opened fire on the University of Texas campus with an assault rifle on September 28, 2010, 44 years after the 1966 shooting.
My class was just underway at 8:07, next door to the library site where the shooting might have taken place, when a couple of students ran in. This is toward the back of the class.
That's Professor Stephen Reese. He was on campus that day teaching his critical issues in journalism class. He later recorded his memories of that day in a Facebook post, which he was reading just a moment ago. About 300 to 400 students were in his class, so they were all in a large lecture hall. The students who ran in were toward the back, about 50 yards from where Professor Reese stood on a somewhat raised platform up front.
I could see them coming toward me, and I jokingly asked, is somebody chasing you? And they said someone was shooting outside. And of course that got my attention.
He locked the sets of double doors on either side of the room before he called the office for the Dean of the College of Communication. Professor Reese asked the Dean's office to call the police since he thought many people were already calling the police department and the office had a better chance of getting through. He then projected local news broadcasts on the screens behind him. He and the students watched as the shooting unfolded outside.
I had a routine that I would follow. So once that routine sort of locks in, you're the teacher, you're starting the class, here are the students, you're communicating with them. I just kind of continued with that mode that I'm giving them some guidance and telling them what to do, but I didn't have to stay calm because they were pretty cool about it. Of course, everybody's nervous. You don't know what's happening, but the fact that we could be in touch, I think they were all on their phones too. The fact that we had some kind of indication of what was happening, or that, or at least some connection to the outside, that I think made it a little more tolerable.
Outside, a student was firing an AK-47. He fired 11 times into the air and toward buildings as he passed through the busiest parts of campus. He walked toward the Perry Castañeda Library, the biggest library on campus, It's the building right next to the one where Professor Reese was teaching. Technically, the two buildings are connected. Before entering the library, the shooter unrolled a ski mask over his face. The lecture hall didn't have any windows, so he and the students couldn't see or hear what was happening outside the locked doors.
There was that period of time where we were kind of on lockdown. It was a little scary in the middle of that because there was a pounding on the door, and the students I could see they kind of moved very quickly but quietly over to the opposite side of the room, and we did not open the door because who knew who it might be. Still had no idea what was happening. So eventually then got the all clear, and life went on from there. But it was a little disconcerting, you can imagine.
In the library next to them, the shooter had shot and killed himself. Only 10 minutes had passed from the first 911 call to when the police found the shooter's body. No one else was injured. I'm Sarah Kinney. Welcome back to Season 4 of Darkness. You are listening to Episode 8. This episode is going to be a bit different from the other episodes so far. I'm going to tell you about the next 5 decades following the shooting in 1966, so everything up to about 2016. As you can imagine, lots of things have happened in half a century, so this episode is going to be more of a collection of stories. For now, let's jump back to 1966. In the first episode of this podcast, I told you this series would be about gun violence in schools, and how that story is very well known to my generation, or really anyone who's attended or worked at a school in the United States in the past few decades. You've heard throughout this podcast that many people on campus on August 1st, 1966 didn't realize a shooting was unfolding around them, and they didn't think it would be a repeated event. They thought it was a one-time tragedy. But what those on campus that day experienced over 50 years ago has become cyclical here in America. A shooting occurs, there's a media frenzy, and people demand justice. And then the outrage fades, and everyone goes back to normal until another one happens, and we go through the motions again, but nothing really changes. Much like today, people in 1966 wanted gun control after the shooting occurred, and President Lyndon B. Johnson did too. Just a few years earlier, he'd ridden in a motorcade through Dallas. He was only 2 cars behind then President John F. Kennedy when he was assassinated by a sniper. The sniper who killed President Kennedy had ordered his rifle from an NRA magazine called American Rifleman. President Johnson wanted to outlaw the sale of guns via magazine and mail order, specifically the sale and shipping of firearms to anyone without a license. He said he knew laws like this wouldn't stop every tragedy, but he hoped it would lower the number that occurred. Despite the snipers in Austin and Dallas, Congress didn't pass the bill. Over the next 2 years, both Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Senator Robert F. Kennedy were shot and killed as well. The pressure on Congress grew until they eventually passed the Gun Control Act of 1968. It banned mail-order guns as well as the sale of guns to felons. The pressure was on Texas Governor John Connally, too. And like President Johnson, he'd been in the Dallas motorcade. Connally was sitting in front of President Kennedy as the car passed through the crowd at Dealey Plaza, and he was also shot by the sniper. So when the shooting occurred at the University of Texas a few years later, he started an investigation. He wanted to find out what happened and what officials might do to prevent it from happening again. He and a team gathered information and reports from the police, the Marine Corps, the university, and more. A month later, Governor Connally published his findings and recommendations on how to move forward. I already talked a bit about it in regards to the autopsy findings in a previous episode, but here's the rest of it. He had 10 recommendations total. Here's a summary of the most significant ones. He proposed a mental health program for students and faculty, saying the program could help people who experienced the shooting, but also students struggling with the everyday stress of being a college student. The report said there would be, quote, no more fitting memorial to those who suffered from this tragic event, and no more worthwhile effort than to anticipate or prevent similar catastrophes can be conceived. At this point, there wasn't a memorial for victims or survivors, and Connolly didn't recommend one either. He did advise the general public and the university to recognize heroes of the day and financially support the survivors of the shooting in their recovery, but not any physical memorial to remember the shooting or the victims. A few decades would pass before any true memorial would even be planned. You'll hear more about it in a future episode. Connolly's recommendations were just that, recommendations, meaning that someone else, such as those at the university level, would actually have to make the changes they felt were warranted after the shooting. The university's Hogg Foundation of Mental Health, which was established in 1940, said the tower shooting led to an employee, Ira Isco, to develop student mental health services. Isco, who was a psychology professor, consulted on Connolly's investigation as a clinical psychologist. Isco modeled the mental health services after his alma mater, the University of California at Los Angeles, which had one of the first student counseling programs in America. Isco proposed adding a 24/7 mental health hotline and services at UT for those who needed it. Governor Connolly's report also recommended that campus security be improved. As I mentioned in an earlier episode, the campus had security guards, but not an official police department or plans for emergency situations. To improve campus safety, Connolly suggested adding a university-wide warning system for emergencies. He also wanted a study on the safety of the tower's observation deck. On a larger level, he wanted the Texas legislature to look into the safety issue in the next legislative session, which they did. Texas passed Senate Bill 162 in 1967. It allows Texas schools to hire police officers specifically for campuses. In 1968, the University of Texas System Police Academy was created, training officers for positions across all University of Texas campuses. The changes didn't stop at the state level. Police across the country realized they were unequipped to deal with incidents like snipers. SWAT, short for Special Weapons and Tactics, was soon established in the hopes of arming police with both knowledge and equipment for these situations. They were trained to deal with snipers, hostage cases, and more. If you've seen modern coverage of school shootings in America, you've probably seen SWAT being called to the scene, including at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, in May of 2022. The police waited for over an hour before confronting the shooter. The police's response to Uvalde has been widely criticized, especially after footage was released of them standing in the hallway inside the school. 19 students and 2 teachers were killed, making it now the deadliest school shooting in Texas. 17 others were injured by the gunman. Officer Philip Connor, who responded to the tower shooting in 1966, kept track of the Uvalde situation as updates were released.
But it's easy to Monday morning quarterback out of a chair, then you're not there, but nobody was in charge, and that should never happen. It just shouldn't have happened.
Claire Wilson, who was shot on the University of Texas campus back in 1966, also saw issues in the police's handling of the shooting at Robb Elementary.
SWAT teams have done they've made a lot of mistakes, and we've wasted a lot of money through the years on cities having, all that equipment and everything, and it just doesn't always work. But anyway, the one thing that does work is when an officer goes straight to where the shooter is. That's the one thing that works, but it might cost a life. And I think that, that's what happened in Uvalde. People were afraid.
Ranger Ray, who took down the sniper in 1966, also had his own thoughts on the Uvalde situation. He wrote an opinion column for the Austin American-Statesman newspaper called
It's the high-capacity magazine, stupid. And I'm going with that old political deal, it's the economy, stupid. So I decided to use the same thing. And I had high hopes that the bipartisan committee working on gun issues would be the beginning of baby steps towards creating sensible gun laws to reduce the carnage that prevails in their country.
The article included some of his ideas on how to stop future shootings, specifically getting rid of high-capacity magazines for guns. When I visited him, I asked if he could read me the article. He had a clipping of it stashed away in his desk drawer.
My suggestion to minimize this problem is as follows. Excluding police and the military, make it a felony to possess a magazine capable of holding more than 10 rounds. It could be called the Child Killer Magazine Law. Current owners of weapons with high-capacity magazines could exchange their magazines courtesy of the state of Texas. If necessary, the state could finance this magazine exchange program with funds from the Rainy Day Fund, which has a balance of about $11.4 billion in 2021.
He told me that the Uvalde shooting brought back his memories from 1966.
Hearing Dr. Roy Guerrero, the pediatrician who treated the mass shooters victims in Uvalde, describing the mutilation of the children's bodies brought back memories that still haunt me 56 years later. At the University of Texas, as I made my way up the stairs backed by civilian Ellen Crum, I came upon the body of a 13-year-old Mark Gabor.
Mark Gabor, along with his mom, brother, and aunt, had been shot in the stairwell of the tower before the sniper went onto the observation deck. Mark and his aunt had died by the time Ranger Ray found the family.
Every time there is a mass shooting, the image and other haunt me as I try to my sleep. My only recourse is to write in hopes that someone may listen and come up with a solution. Like they say, the power of the pen is greater than the sword.
Ranger Ray saw the futility in the situation since most Texas lawmakers aren't pushing for gun safety laws.
I wish the teachers in America would go on strike and say enough is enough. We are not going back to school until children can be safe there. But why put it on the teachers? Where are the parents? In the meantime, the NRA, as a courtesy to their political supporters, should send them pre-printed our thoughts and prayer cards.
He finished his article off with a wish.
God bless America with an abundance of common sense.
Ranger Ray's criticism of law enforcement responses to shootings didn't start with Uvalde. In episode 5, I mentioned that the Austin Police Department didn't do a critique of August 1st, 1966.
The thing to do whenever you have an incident like this, like I started off at the beginning, is that you have to have a critique and let the chips fall where they may. Here is the things that we did right. Here's the things that we did wrong. And here's the things that we need to improve, and this is the equipment that we need. Not only is it beneficial for our department, but it's beneficial for other departments to use, as a blueprint for incidents like this.
So Ranger Ray decided to make his own.
You compare it to Uvalde. It took so long for the officers to do something to take care of. Well, the same thing happened in Austin, that everybody was shooting up at the tower, hoping to hit the guy. But nobody had the brains to go inside, go there and confront the shooter.
His critique listed some of the things he thinks the police department could have done better that day in 1966. He said the biggest problem was that nobody took charge, something law enforcement is now taught in trainings. He said this was also part of the issue with the police's response at Uvalde.
That's what they teach the first officer. Is supposed to go in there and he's supposed to make contact with the defendant or the shooter.
Ranger Ray had run into the tower alone on August 1st, 1966. And he said some people didn't approve of his decision afterward.
So I just went on up, And I got criticized by some people for doing that I didn't wait. Well, how could I wait? I was not in touch with the police department because back in those days we did not have the communications that they have nowadays.
After the tower shooting, the Austin Police Department did make a few changes, even without having conducted a critique. They got a trailer for communications with several radios to improve communications between individual officers and the department. Ranger Ray also said APD assigned 2 officers to find a few rifles with scopes just in case an incident like this happened again. They also got blueprints of tall buildings where snipers could potentially set up. While the police department was making these improvements, Ranger Ray was attending numerous award ceremonies for stopping the sniper on August 1st.
I was receiving the awards as I felt as a representative of the police department. And I was proud to represent my police department.
Eventually, his police chief told him he couldn't go to these ceremonies anymore.
He says, "You've been disruptive by taking too much time to go to functions, where they have presented you with something." He says, "I'm going to write a letter and respectfully decline that you cannot because you're busy." I don't know. I just teed me off. I mean, there was no need for that.
While Ranger Ray was struggling to see eye to eye with the police chief, Houston McCoy eventually ended up leaving the police department. Here's Officer Philip Connor talking about McCoy.
Houston, after he had a pretty serious drinking problem, he had an incident, which I'm not going to describe this because it's private, but he was terminated.
Officer Connor said McCoy started drinking after the shooting.
He didn't really drink before that. That all came later. They don't like me to drink.
But McCoy's children, Christopher and Monica, remember it differently.
I know a lot's been said about my dad's alcoholism and stuff like that in the past, from past interviews, but one thing that people don't realize is he never really ever talked about this or ever showed any sign of this bothering him or anything. Things have been misconstrued over the years that he had an alcoholism and couldn't keep a job. He worked all the way until 1987.
After leaving the Austin Police Department, McCoy worked for a few years as a jailer in Texas. Then he retired and worked at a camp for Boy Scouts. Despite what McCoy's children remember, his friend Philip Connor said he thinks the alcoholism did cause other issues in McCoy's life.
It affected his life and his marriage. They ended up getting divorced. They were amiable. The kids and Ruth were, still speaking. That wasn't one of these, split up and go your separate ways. They, still functioned as a family unit. He just had some serious issues.
Therapy wasn't as commonly accepted in the 1960s as it is today.
I think I heard Philip Connor and my dad both say one time, even if it was available, it wasn't really accepted to go and get that help.
Officer McCoy's children told me his life went on like normal. They remember him camping and fishing when they were young. He didn't talk about the shooting much with family. Monica said she didn't remember hearing about it until she was a teenager.
If I had heard anything more about it prior to that, I really didn't know what it was. It's not like we sat down as a family and discussed these things and said this is what happened. Give my dad, very private man, very humble man, just not anything. It was not always on the forefront of his mind. So to the best of my recollection, like in-depth and in detail conversation started happening around 2006. And that's when I really, really started to learn the intricacies of the story, and what took place.
When you buy Kroger brand products, you feel like you're winning. That's because they offer proven quality at lower than low prices. In fact, we guarantee that you and your family will love how Kroger brand products taste, or you get your money back. So next time you're shopping for the family, look for delicious Kroger brand products, because they'll make you all feel like you're winning. Shop now, in-store, or online. Bakers, fresh for everyone.
Meanwhile, Claire Wilson continued her path to recovery. After being shot on campus and losing her child, she spent 4 months in the hospital recovering. 5 years later, she went to a wellness and rehabilitation center in Colorado.
That's probably what did a lot of healing for me. Was I lived out in the mountains and in so many beautiful places. I was raised atheist, and I started believing in God just from being out in the mountains.
She ended up staying there for 7 years and said it played a major role in her mental recovery.
It was also a school for college-age people, and I learned how to do hydrotherapy, massage therapy. I learned how to cook, how to clean. I was raised with maids. I learned how to clean. I learned how to sew, and I was always outdoors. For 7 years, I got to spend so much of my life outdoors, and it was, just like getting another chance at childhood.
Despite all the physical and mental damage the shooting caused her, she didn't want it to define the rest of her life.
I saw a tree once in the forest, and it had been hit by lightning, but it still grew. And I thought, you can be struck, but it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to give up on life.
Claire also said not being able to see everything that was happening around her that day in August of 1966 minimized her trauma.
I heard people yell out, "Mama," and like you hear they do, and I heard screams and groans, but I couldn't see it, and that's probably part of the reason, as I think I mentioned, that it wasn't as horrible for me, because I didn't see a whole lot of people being killed.
She said her friends visiting her in the hospital also helped.
My group was, very warm and loving, and really, visited me in the hospital, and the doctors were amazing. So I think I didn't get the kind of trauma that a lot of people got.
Claire eventually left the wellness center, and her life went on. She became a teacher. I asked her if she was ever worried about a shooting happening at her school.
I never did. I've taught since I was 24, and I never thought about it until about the last year.
We talked in July of 2022, and she said she had seen reports of the hundreds of shootings in the United States that occurred over the first half of the year.
And I never really thought about it. I never felt afraid or like it would happen again or something. But now that they've started being so fast, to me, I know one fellow that works here as maintenance. He walked into my classroom. Nobody was there. It was in the summer. And he said, "Okay, Claire, you're dead," because my room wasn't locked. And I used to make sure all the doors were locked all the time. Or we started doing that more lately. But I'm the only one that probably takes it really seriously. But I just think, I think any person around, even though we're in a very isolated place with not many people, all it takes is one person who has been so damaged that he decides, or she decides, in that unlikely event, to, kill a lot of people.
Even with all the changes in shooting procedures, she said there's one other thing that should change too.
I think we all need to start being a lot kinder and really trying to help each other, and especially children.
Over a decade after leaving the wellness center, she eventually adopted her son, Sirach. Claire put him into piano lessons, which soon became his passion. Years later, Claire took him with her when she drove up to a nursing home in Menard, Texas. Menard is a small town about 130 miles northwest of Austin. Sirach, who turned 27 that year, had played the piano at nursing homes before. But this time was different. The two were going to visit Houston McCoy, one of the men who stopped the sniper.
I took him down when there was a thought that Houston might not be long for the world, and he was very sick. Sirach played. He's a pianist, and he played for Houston.
After he played for McCoy, the three chatted.
I think Houston gave me some things. Oh, yeah, my students had been writing him, and so he gave me some things for them to see.
Claire said McCoy kept telling her and her son one thing over and over.
I'm so sorry that I couldn't help your mother more.
Claire said this wasn't the first time he told her this. The two had first met a few years earlier at a gathering at the University of Texas in Austin.
They introduced me to Houston, and I told him, thank you so much for what you did. And he was so, he was just like, I'm so sorry. He kept apologizing. And I thought, why is he apologizing? He helped save me. He just kept apologizing about me having to be out in the hot sun. He still felt so guilty. He just felt totally guilty about doing that, about, not being able to just rush right up and do something. But, I don't know how you train young men to do those things. They were all so young.
While in the nursing home, Officer McCoy wrote a final reflection on that day, which Monica McCoy read out loud when we talked.
I have been asked many times how the 66 UT Tower incident affected my life. Although it was a significant moment, it was but only one reflection of my life and did not dictate my overall character. When momentous events occur in one's life, you no longer know life without it. That is our journey. With or without August 1st, 1966, I know that I am loved by my family and respected by my many friends, and what else can a man ask for? So being surrounded by my loving family and friends, I go peacefully to more family and friends in the great beyond and know they will escort me to meet my Maker.
Officer McCoy passed away on December 27, 2012, at 72 years old. A gun salute and a horse without a rider honored him before pallbearers carried him under the trees of the cemetery. Claire attended the ceremony and remembers meeting one of Officer McCoy's sons there.
I said, I'm so grateful for what your father did. You know what he said to me? He was always so sorry that he didn't help you more and that you lay in that hot sun.
Let's go back in time again to August 1966 and revisit the story of Jim Bryce. He was the one that was supposed to meet Sandra Wilson in the student union for lunch. Soon after the shooting, he unenrolled from the University of Texas.
I was totally unsatisfied. I saw the worst. I saw a horrible instance of violence used in an attempt to solve a problem. The shooter had a lot of problems, and he chose to deal with those problems in a highly destructive manner. And I dropped out because I sensed all the nuances, and at that point wasn't certain of what direction to go.
He went to Canada for a while before deciding he wanted to pursue law school. He hadn't finished a bachelor's degree, but said he scored well on the law admissions test. So he decided to send a letter to the University of Texas Law School in August of 1967 asking to be admitted.
They said, "That's okay, come ahead, even if you don't have a degree."
Jim moved back to Austin and became a licensed attorney in 1970. On August 1st of every year, he talks to Sandra Wilson over the phone. When the shooting's 20th anniversary arrived in 1986, Jim and Sandra decided to meet in Austin.
And we said, we're going to reenact it, but this time we're going to have lunch.
I did go back in 1986. Was the first time that's like 20 years after, right?
I was sitting in the chuck wagon in the Union. I was sitting there waiting. No, I was not in the Union. I was sitting there waiting for her where I would have been sitting when the TV was on. And I don't remember 20 years later if the TV was there or not. It may not have been, but I was there. I told her that's where I was going to meet her.
We went at a similar time, it was like 12 o'clock.
And so she came in, and there she was. And I hugged her. And then we went down to the chuck wagon. It's still called the chuck wagon. So I went in, and I told, we got a meal. I said, I wanted green beans. He said, we don't have green beans. I said, no, I really want green beans. Well, we don't have any. I said, I want to speak to your management. Colleague over said, I want some green beans on this menu. He said, we don't have those. That's not on today's menu. I said, I'm going to explain to you why I want to have the green beans. 20 years ago at this time, I was sitting right there, and a man walked through the door and told me that this girl was shot. He said, I'll get you some green beans. And I had green beans. I can never look at green beans without thinking that. I had green beans.
Afterward, the two went out with friends in Austin.
And that's when I re-met my husband, and we ended up getting married, and it's kind of nice. So I had two things happen to me on August 1st, so 20 years apart.
Also on campus that day in 1966 was a graduate student named Larry Faulkner. He'd left his chemistry class around 10 minutes before noon and headed over to the tower, which is also known as the main building.
This was before direct deposit. You actually had to go pick up your check at the bursar's office in the main building. I thought that normally they didn't get them there until pretty close to noon. I thought there was a chance that check would be available before noon. If not, I planned to come back on the campus in the afternoon and pick it up.
He said there was a sign saying the checks weren't going to be ready until after 2 p.m. So he walked over to the drag, past the Varsity Theater, to find his car.
I didn't know anything was happening, frankly, on the campus, although I was exposed. There were victims shot in the period when I was walking off the campus. I went to my car. I drove home.
At home, his wife told him what was happening on campus.
We, of course, were flabbergasted. This kind of thing, as you and I mentioned earlier, this was one of the first such events, certainly in American life at that time. One never thought about any event of this kind. I mean, it was beyond imagination. So we were flabbergasted. Of course, you're vulnerable at various times in your life, and I just said a moment ago that I was lucky, and I was lucky. I could have been shot, I think. My sense is I was exposed. It's possible that at that moment he was turned elsewhere. He shot people over by the stadium. He shot people, of course, on the main mall. He shot people over by the Varsity Theater. I can't cover all those angles at once. So at the time I was walking off the campus, he could have been just focused in a different direction.
The event has stayed with him after all these years.
What stays with me most is the shocking novelty of it. I think the thing that stays with me the most is how jarring this event was, because it just nothing like it had ever happened in the United States. Now, there were mass murders, but not anything like just getting into a public place and just shooting anybody who could be reached. That, more than anything, is the most persistent concept for me in this whole process. We were in a period well before where we are now, where we have a shooter a day somewhere in the United States, or every 2 days or 3 days. But right after this event, it was so shocking in its character.
In 1998, Larry Faulkner was named the 27th president of the University of Texas. His office was in the tower.
If people pick one symbol of the University of Texas, or they carry it away as an undergraduate, what is it? It's the tower. It's because it's very prominent, it's distinctive. There are very few universities that have anything similar. It was architecturally very important. Paul Craig was the architect who designed the core part of the campus, the main mall, the South Mall, the East and West Malls. And he's the one who chose the Mediterranean architecture. He's the one who created the tower as a centerpiece.
The university has changed a lot since 1966. But even today, the tower remains at the heart of campus.
That's architectural history of great importance, and it was what he sought to do as an architect, and he was very successful. But if people remember this university, what do they remember first as a physical symbol of this university? It's the tower. And I think it's an expression of the reach for the institution, for the sky, really, and that's what I think.
In 1966, they did temporarily close the observation deck for a few months to plaster over the bullet holes in the tower's walls. Once the repairs were done, they reopened and people could visit just as they could before. In 1998, when Larry Faulkner became president, the tower's observation deck was permanently closed, but not because of the shooting.
The Regents ultimately decided to close the tower because of suicides. It wasn't actually the shooting and even the risk of another shooter. It was suicides that were persistent there.
In the following 6 years between 1968 and 1974, 4 people died by suicide after jumping from the tower's observation deck. Combined with 3 other suicides prior to the shooting and 2 accidents, that meant a total of 9 people had died from falling off the observation deck. After the last suicide in 1974, the deck was temporarily closed, and the Board of Regents that oversaw the university permanently closed it 2 years later. Faulkner said news of a mass shooting, like that on August 1st, was unheard of in 1966, so the shooting's history became tied to the tower.
It's very hard for people in modern-day America to realize that this kind of thing did not happen. It was incredibly shocking. Now, President Kennedy's assassination was incredibly shocking, and it happened just a very few years before. But in this country, political assassinations did occur around the turn of the 20th century and the late 19th century.
But Faulkner wanted to change the tower's legacy during his time as president.
I was here during the events that led to the tower closing. But I could see and saw well before I became president that the verbotenness of the tower, having it off limits, you can't go there. What you would find is that visitors to the campus spent all their time addressing this great symbol of the university. It's a symbol that has meant a lot to generations of students. It was always discussed in terms of the tower shooting and the forbiddenness.
Faulkner wanted to restore the tower's reputation in addition to reopening the observation deck.
We wanted, as members of this community, for the tower to be a symbol of the aspirations of this institution, not just this chapter of its history. So I felt that the only way we would ever get past that as a community was to reopen.
He began working with the chairman of the university's Board of Regents, Don Evans, to reverse the closing decision in 1974.
And we talked about the conditions. I mean, it was obvious to both of us that the security aspects would be critical if you were going to propose a reopening and allow people to go once again to the top of the tower and to experience it. We would have to address the suicides. We would have to address gun security.
The two devised a plan.
We got some architects to look into how we could provide for security against suicides by putting that grill up there that's up there. We talked about gun security being addressed by standard techniques at the base of the tower. And I think we came up with a solution that was obviously practical.
At the observation deck, they installed thin steel rods on the deck's cement outer wall that bent overhead and connect to the tower wall. It encloses visitors to prevent any more falls, but still allows them to see between the bars. This wasn't the only security measure, though. Visitors now have to go through metal detectors and get their bags searched. Additionally, the tower deck would only be accessible by tours, so people could no longer walk up there unescorted.
It was very successful in my mind. I think taking that forbiddenness away and allowing people to go up and experience it however they wanted to, whenever they wanted to, it completely succeeded in the way that I wanted. It wasn't long before people didn't just look at the tower and think of that incident. They looked at it for the reasons we always wanted them to look at it and think about it. And they had experienced it themselves for other purposes, and some people many times. So I think it was all very successful. I think my diagnosis of what needed to be done was correct.
He credits this success to his past.
I became president at the right time for that, and I think the fact that I was a president who had experienced the event itself and was a student here made a tremendous amount of difference.
When you buy Kroger brand products, you feel like you're winning. That's because they offer proven quality at lower than low prices. In fact, we guarantee that you and your family will love how Kroger brand products taste, or you get your money back. So next time you're shopping for the family, look for delicious Kroger brand products, because they'll make you all feel like you're winning. Shop now, in-store, or online. Bakers, fresh for everyone.
So far, I've told you about Ranger Ray, Claire and Officer McCoy, Sandra and Jim, and Larry Faulkner. But let's catch up with a few more people and what they've been up to over the years since the shooting. KTVC News Director Neil Spels went on to have an award-winning career as a journalist.
As a writer and researcher, I was simply an eyewitness, a reporter, often at the right place at the right time. So it is important history in that sense, some people think, but not significant other than the fact it fills in this little gap here and this little gap there.
He followed and reported on President Lyndon B. Johnson and First Lady Lady Bird Johnson throughout the years.
I followed him into the jungles of Vietnam in '61 at the very moment when our advisors were first deployed to aid the South Vietnamese government. It was the beginning of a deeper U.S. involvement in that tragic war. I had wandered this building, library, nooks and crannies, and the library above them with LBJ and Mrs. Johnson when we were planning the dedication ceremony of his presidential ceremony. And I'd held back tears when I oversaw the details that President Johnson was laid to rest on a cold winter's day at the family ranch, and years later when I helped out his remarkable wife made her final journey to rest alongside him in the same sacred ground under the live oaks.
Forrest Preece, who was almost shot on the drag, is still here in Austin. He has reported on the day of the shooting as well as some of the people involved over the decades. His stories were part of a weekly column for the West Austin News newspaper or published on his own website, The Austin Prop. Before I ever interviewed him, he told me via email, quote, "I can tell you that there has not been a day in the ensuing 50-plus years I have not thought of that day." He's reflected a lot on that day and thought about the people that passed by him that day on the drag.
I've actually had dreams about catching them and pulling them, telling them, don't go any further north. Your irrational mind does stupid stuff like that. I mean, you just have fantasies about, I could have saved those people if I knew what the heck was going on, Sometimes I feel really bad about that I didn't do more, but back then you didn't know stuff like this was going on, man. And then, none of this, the mass shootings were just not a everyday thing back then. There hadn't been any Boston bombing or Virginia Tech or Columbine or McDonald's in what was it? One is San Diego, and then the Killeen, the Lubies. I mean, all just on and on and on.
He even wrote a piece about Rita Jones, the student who lied beside Claire during the shooting. She later changed her name to Rita Star Pattern. Rita was a feminist and artist who helped start the Women in Their Work gallery in 1978. It's a nonprofit contemporary art group in Austin that runs workshops and art shows. She passed away in April of 1996. Tom Ekman was Claire Wilson's boyfriend who was killed beside her on August 1st. He loved poetry, and Claire had kept some that he'd written over the years, but isn't sure where all of it is today.
I wish I had his poetry still.
His parents later named a collection after him at Bowling Green State University Library in Ohio. It's called the Thomas F. Ekman Memorial Collection and is a part of the Rare Books and Special Collections Division. Alan Crum, who'd gone into the tower with the police officers to stop the sniper, eventually left Austin. He spent several years in New York before moving to Vegas, where he worked as a repairman for slot machines. He passed away on March 9, 2001, at the age of 75. He had a son, 2 daughters, 5 grandkids, and 6 great-grandkids. He didn't talk to the media much, but he did do an interview with the Austin American-Statesman in 1991. When asked why he ran to the tower, he said he kept thinking about Kitty Genovese and how no one had helped her. Kitty was a 28-year-old woman in New York City. She was attacked by a man who had followed her home after her work shift at a bar in March of 1964. He stabbed her multiple times, raped her, and robbed her. She died in an ambulance on the way to the hospital. The New York Times later wrote an article revealing almost 40 people saw the crimes happen, but didn't call the police or help Kitty. And Alan Crum couldn't let that happen to those he saw on August 1st. Now let's once again go back to August 1st, 1966, and finish off Bob Higley and Cliff Drummond's day. They were the two that had been racing along the drag, helping people during the shooting in episode 3. It might seem odd to put the rest of their day here rather than in the previous episodes, but you'll hear why in a few minutes. Bob was standing next to Cliff near the tower when they realized the shooting was over.
Drummond then says, "I need to get to the student newspaper building, the Daily Texan office," which at that time was on the same street, back up the hill.
Cliff was asked to do a radio interview. Bob was still reeling from what had just happened.
I jumped on top of a air conditioning vent and box, and you could sit up on top of them and literally freeze your tail off. And if you didn't want to get frozen, you just got between 2 vents.
The adrenaline faded away.
And kicked back, and I was dead tired.
After Cliff finished the interview, he drove Bob over to Cliff's apartment. They joined some friends at the apartment pool.
And we sat around and drank. They drank bourbon, I drank scotch. Maybe I mixed it with a little beer.
Early the next morning, Bob called his parents. He needed a ride home.
I don't remember where my car was parked. I had to call my dad to come fetch me. He brought me home. My mother and Dad had been waiting up. It's about 2:30 in the morning. And they said when I walked in, I was as white as a sheet. So I don't think I was totally functioning.
Bob hadn't really processed what had happened that day.
When you're in that kind of a situation, your brain is all about one thing, survival. And it leaves gaps. It's moving and focusing on so many things. It leaves gaps. Well, apparently the brain hates gaps, so it fills them with things that it can manage, manageable memories. It's a traumatic experience. It's not normal. And you will remember things that never happened. Never flaming happened. And you will swear on a stack of Bibles you have a clear memory of it.
After all these years, Bob realized some of his memory might be his brain filling in details rather than what truly happened.
Years later, I'm working on this problem with a professional. And he said, "Are you sure of all your facts?" "No, I just don't remember." "Who could help you?"
He told me he remembers being with 5 of his friends that day. After talking to the professional, Bob wanted to call one of them to figure out if what he remembers is true. He told me that 2 of his friends had died by then, and he lost track of another over the years, so he couldn't ask any of them. And he also didn't want to call Cliff.
I'm not sure he'll remember.
So there was only one option left, a friend named Melinda. He asked her about another friend he thought they'd been with, named Mary Nell.
So I call Melinda. She says, "Bob, my dad and I were in the car listening on the radio, driving back from Hillsboro or Waxahachie. That was the first time we ever heard of it. No, I wasn't at the event. And oh, by the way, I don't think Mary Nell was there."
This means Bob actually didn't see 2 of his friends that he thought he saw that day.
Well, years later, I'm telling Drummond the story, and he said, "Higley, one of the reasons I went in the radio station was to get on the air so Mary Nell would know that I was still alive. She was in Spain. Remember, she was, oh God," I said, "I knew this."
Mary Nell and Cliff later got married just over a year after the shooting in 1967.
I can tell you, if you asked me what happened to this day, I would be uncomfortable telling you this story that I just told you. And I am uncomfortable.
He said not being sure of the details was what made him uncomfortable.
Why just these details? You think you know what you know. But unless someone was there to verify it.
He knows that not everything from that day can be verified.
You can verify the shells that go into the bricks of the Cadeau. But what about the other things that you remember? What's going on in your mind is, don't hold dear to it because it might not be right. I'm just dead right when I tell you what I remember. But I'm absolutely also of the opinion that I'm dead wrong. Mary Nell was verifiably in Spain. Cliff had gone out with friends other than me and Charlie and Millie, and I can't verify with Charlie and Millie that they were there. One's dead and the other one's out of my life.
Since then, Cliff has also passed. He died on September 11th, 2020, about a decade after his wife, Mary Nell. So Bob can't even check his memories with the person who was with him most of August 1st anymore. I talked with another person who, like Bob, wasn't confident in her memory after all these years. Her name is Lynn Dawson, and in 1966, she was a 20-year-old recent graduate of the University of Texas, still living in Austin. I'll let her tell you what she remembers happening that day.
I heard something on the radio that said there was some kind of activity going on at UT, and I wanted to know what. So I got into the car and drove over, and I could see helicopters flying around, and I could see a lot of police.
She parked about 4 blocks away from the drag and walked closer to campus.
Then I stopped because I could see people hiding behind buildings or in the sides of buildings or in doorways or something like that. So I did too. And I could hear pops, pops going on. And you could see chips of wood flying up off of the buildings, off the side of the buildings.
Some people rode past on bicycles, confused about what everyone was doing. Nobody told them to hide, though.
Everyone was just preoccupied with what was happening. I didn't see anybody talking or yelling or anything like that, like get off of the street and anything like that. Everybody was just busy trying to protect themselves. The only thing I really remember seeing is once the shooting stopped, I walked over to the drag, and I remember the blood and the heat, and, there were a lot of ambulances around.
However, Lynn isn't sure this is all that actually happened to her that day. When I met her in person for our interview, she pulled me aside before the mics were on and handed me a piece of paper. It was part of a letter she'd written to a friend on August 1st, 1966. She found it prior to our meeting and wanted to show me since it recounted her day. But as she reread it before our meeting, she realized she didn't remember parts of her letter. The first page is missing, but here she is reading the second page.
Blood was everywhere. I wrote 46 people had been hit, so plenty of other people were lying around, although they had some of them out. I guess I meant picking them up. He had such a great location that the ones they got out were pretty few, of course. The real gore didn't start till they started bringing people out of the tower. It was a fantastic shot. He was shooting into the stores on the drag and one of the jewelry stores.
It had lots of details about the state of the drag after the shooting that she didn't remember.
The glass window looked exactly like this hole. I did like that. I put 4 football fields away from here. He shot the man inside the store, the jewelry store, I guess. He was there about 1 hour and 20 minutes, and he shot someone less than every 2 minutes on an average. He shot a man inside a barber shop. If you ever come down, you can see the bullet holes if you want. The campus is riddled.
She wrote about another girl who was hiding too.
One girl was trapped behind a flagpole right under him the whole time. She just crouched behind the pole and cried and sort of beat her fists on the side of the pole. Every once in a while, a bullet would zing by and hit the pole. There was a circle around the lower part of the pole, I guess, with blood, bullet holes, and people. It took a while for it all to sink in on me.
She wrote to her old school friend about the people that were reported injured or dead.
The whole thing is so unbelievable. Blood was on most of the carpets in the stores on the drag. I feel slightly upset now, really. He shot a boy off a bicycle 7 blocks away. 3 shots with different sized guns that hit this close together. We said, what I remember from the day was that it was very, very hot. And there was a lot of blood on the drag, on the sidewalk and in the store. And the smell of the blood and the sight of it was sickening.
When she finished reading the details of the letter, I asked her why she thought she didn't remember all of those details. She didn't think it was trauma like Bob, though.
Is there any reason that you think these details have kind of slipped your mind after 56 years?
56 years. I'm 78. So.
It's now been 57 years since the shooting, which might play a role in why it's been forgotten over the years. If you hear the phrase first mass school shooting, you'll probably think of Columbine in 1999, not the University of Texas.
If I told somebody I was in the first school shooting, they always say, "Oh, Columbine." Because, that was the first, lower grade school, but the first school shooting, of course, was UT.
That's Claire Wilson again. She's not alone in thinking that the tower shooting has gone forgotten. Jim Bryce has noticed this too.
Have you noticed? When they start talking about school shootings, they almost never mention the University of Texas. They might mention Columbine. Nobody even knows.
The development of SWAT, 911, cell phones, and so many other things divides today's school shootings from the one in 1966. While Neil Spelce reported on the tower shooting over 50 years ago, he has since watched as the media has reported on other mass shootings today.
Now, sadly to say, a lot of shootings and events similar to this have occurred in the ensuing half century. And it's just one of those tragic things that is, I'm afraid, probably going to continue in some form or another, just because of the way society is moving now.
But before modern shootings became regular headlines and the tower tragedy faded from people's memories, Neil thinks there was another reason the tower shooting was remembered: the fact that so much footage exists of the shooting.
The film was not only the first, but for many, many decades, it was the only film that actually showed what was happening in a mass shooting. Now think about that. Columbine High School, that all happened inside. Nobody saw any of that. That happened out away. Virginia Tech shooting inside, that was all, nobody saw it. All they saw, the images, even in modern day technology with satellites there, all they saw was crime scene tape, cops running outside, and people hugging each other in grief.
On campus that day, reporters filmed everything, like students carrying injured people to safety, including John Fox and James Love carrying Claire Wilson. They filmed those that had died lying on the pavement with their belongings still scattered around them. They filmed people on gurneys being wheeled or carried out of the tower.
This is history, and while it's a bleak part of our existence, it is still an important part and needs to be covered in that regard.
Their recordings documented the horror that unfolded that day, and today you can still see their work online.
It's one of those things that come time as it passes on by, this will fade somewhat from memory, but it won't go away. And it shouldn't go away. We should be reminded that this sort of thing did happen and can happen again.
Next time on Season 4 of Darkness.
It's ridiculous that people can get a hold of assault rifles. I'm sorry. That's just ridiculous. You don't need that for deer hunting.
And I think it's really clear that folks want to prevent gun violence. Nobody wants their child, their friend, their neighbor to die looking down the barrel of a gun. That's just the simple truth.
No kid has to do what any kid had to do that day. So no kid should have to run across a highway. No kid should have to hide in a closet to hide from a shooter.
I feel safe here. But that's the thing, is like, can you feel safe anywhere?
This season of Darkness is reported, written, and hosted by me, Sarah Kinney. Heather Stewart is this season's producer, sound designer, and editor. Katie Penchikautka and Robert Quigley are the executive producers. This podcast is presented by the Drag Audio Production House, which is part of Texas Student Media at the University of Texas at Austin's Moody College of Communication. The associate producers are Jade Emerson, Liv Gamble, Cameron Greiser, Mackenzie Matwick, Ashley Miznazi, Marissa Green, MJ Tilton, Guido Palufo, Liam Quigley, Aurora Berry, and Jeannie Sanchez. The cover art was created by Alexa Georgelos. Sophia Vargas Karam is the drag's marketing and communications manager. Thank you to the Austin History Center, Neil Spels, and the LBJ Presidential Library for help with the archival audio tapes. Special thanks to the University of Texas School of Journalism and Media and Texas Student Media. Also to Jay Bernhardt, Rachel Davis Mercy, David Reif, and Gerald Johnson. A huge thanks to Leslie Schrock for all her support and guidance. The Drag is a non-profit educational organization that is made possible by individual donations. Please support our work by going to thedragaudio.com/donate. Every dollar goes directly to producing more content like this, while giving students an amazing educational experience. Thank you.
When you buy Kroger brand products, you feel like you're winning. That's because they offer proven quality at lower than low prices. In fact, we guarantee that you and your family will love how Kroger brand products taste, or you get your money back. So next time you're shopping for the family, look for delicious Kroger brand products, because they'll make you all feel like you're winning. Shop now, in-store, or online. Bakers, fresh for everyone.